In the waning years of the Regency, when Britain's nobility clung to order with brittle determination, Lady Eleanor Harrow stepped into a world that had never expected her to matter. At 26, she was older than a fashionable bride and possessed a mind sharper than society approved. Her family's estate, worn thin by her father's illness and years of quiet decline, left her with few prospects. Yet even as circumstance pressed her toward practicality, she carried herself with a calm dignity that refused to bow beneath misfortune. The Duke of Ashcombe, summoned back into public view by unrest in his northern lands, approached their arranged marriage with the air of a man fulfilling a necessity. He was tall, impeccably composed, and shadowed by grief. His late wife had been admired across England, her charm woven into stories whispered long after her passing. Since her death, the Duke had withdrawn from society, speaking only when required, leaving the management of his estate to stewards who could not quell growing tensions. During the journey to Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor attempted to draw him into conversation, offering observations on the countryside and questions about the tenants she hoped to serve. His replies were brief, politely distant, the responses of a man guarding himself against even the smallest thread of familiarity. She did not resent him. She merely recognized that her presence pressed upon an old wound he had no wish to reopen. Still, she continued trying, determined at least to understand the terrain of her new life. Ashcombe Hall emerged from the moorland like a fortress softened by ivy and twilight. Its facade, impressive yet solemn, seemed to reflect the Duke himself. Eleanor stepped from the carriage and felt the estate's weight settle onto her shoulders. Servants lined the entrance, their bows precise, their curiosity tucked behind decorum. The Duke offered no arm as they entered, and she followed without comment, studying the measured elegance of the place that would now define her days. Supper that evening passed in stiff quiet. The Duke ate with mechanical efficiency, rarely lifting his eyes. Eleanor attempted conversation, asking about the rhythms of the household and her expected duties. He deflected each inquiry with a courteous assurance that the staff would instruct her. Though his tone remained civil, every word reinforced the wall he had constructed between them. Eleanor forced herself to remain steady. If she could not reach him, she would at least learn the contours of this new existence. After the meal, he escorted her down a long corridor lit by wavering candlelight. The shadows trembled along the walls, making the silence feel heavier. At the threshold of her chamber, Eleanor paused, offering him a small, sincere smile meant only to acknowledge their shared circumstance. She hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might respond with some gesture of human connection. Instead, he inhaled softly, as though bracing himself. "You should not expect affection from me," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "I feel no love, no wanting for you." The words, though not unkind, were delivered with the finality of a sealed door. Eleanor felt a brief, piercing stillness inside her. She had prepared for distance, but not for such stark rejection spoken so plainly. Yet she met his gaze without faltering. "I do not ask for sentiment you cannot offer," she replied quietly. "Only the chance to live this life with dignity." Her voice remained steady, though her pulse throbbed at the restraint required. The Duke inclined his head, acknowledging her poise with a fleeting flicker of recognition. Whether it was respect or regret she could not tell. "Good night, Your Grace," he said, making the title a boundary rather than an honor. Then he stepped away, his figure receding into the dim corridor. Left alone, Eleanor entered her chamber. Its beauty, pale silks, polished walnut, and delicate embroidery, felt hollow in the absence of welcome. She crossed to the window, drawing strength from the cool night air. The moor beyond stretched into darkness, vast and unknowable. She wondered whether this land, with its restless winds and quiet endurance, might one day reflect something within her. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, a composed woman whose eyes revealed nothing of the ache beneath. She had been chosen for duty, not desire, but she would not allow that to diminish her. If affection was denied, she would seek purpose. She would learn the estate, support the tenants, and make herself necessary in ways no indifference could erase. As the candlelight thinned, Eleanor unpinned her hair, letting it fall in loose waves. The simple act felt like reclaiming a part of herself untouched by the marriage contract. Tonight had stripped away her last illusions, yet it left her with a clarity she had not anticipated. The Duke's heart was locked behind grief, But she still possessed her own, and she intended to use it. The hall grew quiet around her, settling into its nocturnal rhythm. Somewhere beyond her chamber, the Duke withdrew into solitude, clinging to the memory of a love he believed irreplaceable. Eleanor sensed that his confession had cost him something, though he likely did not see it. His certainty that love had only one life troubled her, yet she refused to let his despair define her future. She extinguished the final candle and slipped into bed, feeling the weight of the day settle atop her like a thin, inevitable cloak. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the Duke's indifference and the responsibilities of her new title. Yet beneath her lingering disappointment, a quiet resolve took shape. Duty had placed her in Ashcombe Hall, but her own strength would determine the life she forged within it. And though the night held the echo of his rejection, she felt, faintly, the first stirring of a resolve that might, with time and patience, become something steadier. She closed her eyes, knowing the story of this marriage had only just begun. The morning after her arrival, Eleanor descended the sweeping staircase of Ashcombe Hall with the poise of someone determined not to reveal the bruise left by the Duke's confession. The household stirred with quiet efficiency, each servant moving along well-established paths that hinted at a rhythm she had yet to understand. She sensed discreet glances in her direction, curiosity restrained by propriety, but she welcomed them. To be observed was, at least, to be acknowledged. She took her place at the breakfast table alone, noting the Duke's absence with a mixture of relief and disappointment. A footman informed her that His Grace had ridden out early to inspect the estate borders. Eleanor thanked him gently, savoring the small spark of respect that flickered in his eyes when she used his name. Determined not to drift through the day as an ornamental bride, she requested a tour of the hall. Mrs. Halloway, the long-serving housekeeper, guided her through rooms that bore the weight of generations. Grand salons lined with ancestral portraits, studies filled with maps and ledgers, and sunlit corridors warmed by tapestries depicting centuries of triumphs and quiet tragedies. Eleanor absorbed every detail with careful attention. She asked about the staff, the estate schedule, and the customs expected of the Duchess of Ashcombe. Mrs. Halloway, though cautious at first, warmed under Eleanor's steady interest. By midday, the housekeeper's tone had softened from formality to something almost protective, as though she recognized in Eleanor a figure who might restore a neglected harmony. Later, Eleanor ventured into the gardens, where clipped hedges framed paths leading toward the distant moor. She breathed deeply, letting the crisp air settle her thoughts. She needed to learn how to serve this place without relying on a husband who offered her no space in his life. The gardeners watched her with subtle surprise when she asked about their work. Her curiosity, rooted in genuine respect rather than idle distraction, slowly chipped away at their reserve. She listened as they described the soil, the seasonal challenges, and the ways the estate had changed since the old Duchess's death. Eleanor felt the unspoken grief embedded in their recollections, a grief that still clung to the hall like lingering fog. By afternoon, she attended her first meeting with the household's senior staff. Though the Duke had not requested her presence, she insisted on participating. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that silenced objections. She reviewed the schedules, studied the logistics of the estate's operations, and asked precise questions that revealed how much she sought to understand rather than control. The steward, Mr. Rathbone, regarded her with a wary respect that slowly deepened into genuine consideration. When she suggested modest improvements to the distribution of supplies for winter preparations, he acknowledged the wisdom of her proposals with a reluctant nod. Eleanor felt a faint glow of accomplishment. Competence, at least, remained her ally. The Duke returned near dusk, his presence rippling through the household like a shift in temperature. Eleanor observed him from the end of the corridor as he handed his coat to a footman. His expression was impassive, but the tautness around his eyes betrayed unease. Whether caused by estate troubles or the memory of the previous night, she could not tell. He greeted her with a polite inclination of his head when their paths crossed, and she responded with equal formality. No resentment colored her tone. She offered him the courtesy of someone unwilling to add to his burdens. He seemed faintly surprised by her composure, though he spoke no more than necessary. That evening, they dined together again, but the silence between them felt less suffocating than the night before. Eleanor spoke sparingly, offering brief remarks on her tour of the hall. The Duke listened without interruption, though his gaze seldom lingered on her. She sensed an internal struggle beneath his reserved demeanor, a conflict between habit and an emerging awareness that she was not the fragile shadow he might have expected. When she mentioned a minor inefficiency she had noticed in the storage wing, his eyebrow lifted slightly, as though her attention to detail had caught him off guard. Still, he offered neither praise nor criticism, retreating behind the neutrality of a man who refused to encourage hope. After supper, Eleanor retreated to the small reading room adjacent to her chamber. The room had been untouched for months, perhaps years, and the faint scent of dust and lavender hung in the air. She pulled a volume from the shelf and settled into a deep armchair, letting the soft crackle of the fire soothe her. But her thoughts wandered back to the Duke, his solitude, and the invisible walls he so carefully maintained. She wondered whether grief always hardened into such impenetrable stone or if his detachment masked a fear he could not articulate. As she turned a page, footsteps halted outside the doorway. The Duke appeared on the threshold, as if unsure whether to continue. His expression carried the slightest trace of hesitation, a rare fissure in his usually controlled exterior. Eleanor closed her book gently, inviting conversation without demanding it. He stepped inside, though only far enough to be illuminated by the fire's glow. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt different this time, not heavy with rejection but suspended between them like an unplayed note. "I trust the staff has been helpful," he said at last, his tone composed yet edged with something human. Eleanor inclined her head. "They have shown me great patience. I intend to earn their confidence." The Duke studied her, and in that brief examination she sensed he was reassessing the portrait he had drawn of her. Perhaps he expected compliance or fragility. Instead he found steadiness. He nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been missed by anyone less attentive. "The estate requires stability," he murmured, half to himself. "If you can support that, I will not hinder you." His words were not affectionate, not even warm, but they carried a subtle shift, permission where there had once been dismissal. Eleanor met his gaze, recognizing the small concession for what it was. "I will do what I can," she replied softly. He lingered a moment longer, then withdrew, leaving her with a fading echo of steps that suggested uncertainty rather than indifference. Eleanor sat quietly, letting the encounter settle within her. It was not progress in any romantic sense, nor did it promise a swift unraveling of his grief. But it hinted at the possibility of coexistence built on mutual competence rather than emotional vacancy. And though the night still held its shadows, she sensed the faintest stirring of a path forward, one she intended to walk with determination, regardless of whether the Duke eventually chose to join her. Winter sharpened its hold over Ashcombe's northern lands, and with it came a restlessness that threaded through every conversation in the hall. Eleanor felt it first in the tense exchanges between servants, then in the clipped reports from Mr. Rathbone, and finally in the Duke's increasingly distracted demeanor. Though he seldom spoke of the estate beyond what necessity demanded, she sensed a pressure building beneath his composure, as though the moorland winds had begun to scour away the surface of his restraint. She approached him cautiously, hoping to understand the cause of the strain, but he dismissed her inquiries with polite finality. His avoidance troubled her, not from wounded pride but from the conviction that leadership required clarity. Something was stirring beyond the hall's stone walls, and she needed to know what threatened the land she was learning to call her own. The answer arrived in the form of a messenger whose boots were still muddy from the journey north. He carried grievances from the Ashcombe tenants, complaints of rising rents, shortages of grain, and the failure of promised repairs to workers' cottages. Eleanor listened in solemn silence while the Duke stood rigidly by the hearth, his jaw clenched as the accusations unfolded. When the messenger departed, leaving a chill in his wake, the Duke remained motionless, staring into the fire with an expression that blended guilt with stubborn refusal. Eleanor approached him gently, careful not to provoke defensive silence. "These matters must be addressed," she said. "If we ignore them, the unrest will only spread." His reply was curt, revealing the depth of his frustration. "The tenants have endured worse winters. They will endure this one as well." Eleanor refused to accept such indifference. She had reviewed the estate accounts and seen how the combination of neglect and mismanagement had frayed the tenants' loyalty. She understood their anger, even if the Duke could not. His grief had narrowed his world, reducing it to a single axis upon which nothing beyond memory seemed to turn. Yet the estate demanded more than mourning. It required a steward with vision. When she suggested visiting the villages to hear concerns directly, he dismissed the idea outright. "There is no need for you to involve yourself in matters beyond your experience," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable edge of command. Though the words stung, Eleanor remained steady. "Experience begins with action," she replied, "and leadership requires presence." The following morning, she left before dawn with 2 stable hands and a wagon filled with provisions. Frost clung to the fields, turning the moor into a pale expanse of silence. As they rode toward the northern villages, Eleanor rehearsed the conversation she hoped to initiate, steadying herself against the uncertainty that accompanied each mile. When they arrived, she found the tenants wary but not hostile. Her presence surprised them, particularly when she carried baskets of flour and blankets personally. She listened to complaints with patient sincerity, making notes in a small leather-bound book. Their concerns were practical, not unreasonable. Roofs that leaked, grain stores thinned by early storms, and rents that strained already burdened households. Eleanor offered no false promises, only her commitment to bring their voices directly to the Duke. By the time she returned to the hall, dusk had fallen and her cloak was heavy with cold. The Duke awaited her in the entrance hall, his expression thunderous. He dismissed the servants with a flick of his hand and confronted her in a voice low with anger. "You jeopardized your safety," he said. "You acted without my consent." Eleanor met his ire without flinching. "I acted because action was required. You may choose to ignore their struggles, but I will not." His breath hitched, as though her defiance unsettled him more than the unrest itself. For a moment, he looked at her with something like disbelief, as if he were seeing her not as the quiet bride chosen for convenience, but as a force he had underestimated. Over the next days, the Duke reviewed her notes in strained silence. He paced his study, rereading the tenants' grievances again and again, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. Eleanor watched him wrestle with the conflict between pride and obligation. She offered observations only when asked, careful not to intrude upon his internal struggle. Gradually, his anger gave way to reluctant acknowledgement. One evening, after hours of tense review, he spoke with a quiet resignation that made her heart tighten. "You saw what I would not," he admitted. "I have allowed my grief to blind me to the needs of my own people." Eleanor did not respond with triumph. She simply nodded, recognizing the courage required for such a confession. Their fragile understanding deepened when old letters resurfaced from the archives, notes penned by his late wife regarding the tenants' welfare. Eleanor discovered them while organizing estate documents, and though she hesitated, she delivered them to the Duke. He accepted the letters with trembling hands, his composure fracturing as he read the familiar handwriting. She stepped back, granting him the privacy he needed, but the echo of his grief lingered in the corridor long after he closed the study door. It became clear to Eleanor that the estate's unrest had forced him to confront not only managerial neglect but the haunting specter of comparison, the fear that he had failed to uphold the compassion his first wife had embodied. The following night, a fierce storm swept across the moor, rattling the windows and filling the hall with an eerie, restless hum. Eleanor found the Duke in the library, staring at the rain-slashed glass with an expression carved from sorrow. She approached cautiously, sensing the vulnerability that clung to him like a second shadow. "Your Grace," she said softly, "you do not have to face this alone." He turned toward her, his eyes haunted yet searching. For the first time, he did not retreat behind the safety of formality. "I have forgotten how to believe in partnership," he murmured. "I fear that if I try, I will fail again." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice a steady whisper in the storm's roar. "Failure lies in refusal, not in effort. You still have the capacity to lead and to heal, but only if you allow yourself to see beyond what you have lost." He held her gaze, torn between resistance and the faintest flicker of trust. The moment hung suspended, a fragile thread stretched between 2 wounded hearts. Then, with a quiet exhale that sounded like surrender, he nodded. It was not affection, nor even warmth, but it was the first opening he had offered her, not as a symbol of duty, but as a partner in the rebuilding of Ashcombe's future. And for Eleanor, that was enough to begin. Even before the guests departed, Eleanor sensed the evening had altered the very atmosphere of Ashcombe Hall, as though the house itself recognized the faint but undeniable shift in its master's heart. The Duke walked beside her with a steadiness she had never before witnessed, not the rigid endurance of a man locking away grief, but the tentative balance of someone relearning how to breathe. Though the night's confrontation still lingered in her thoughts, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her, a fragile reassurance that the work they had begun together was no longer hers to shoulder alone. The following morning brought a subdued brightness, the kind that hinted at renewal without declaring it boldly. Eleanor descended the stairs to find the Duke already awaiting her, his expression gentler than usual, as though the previous night had eased a knot long tightened within him. He offered to accompany her on her usual rounds, a gesture so unexpected she almost questioned his sincerity. Yet when she agreed, he followed her through the corridors without hesitation, listening as she described the necessary repairs, the tenants' concerns, and the gradual rebuilding of trust. His silence no longer felt like concealment but contemplation, a turning inward that prepared him to look outward again. When they arrived at the estate's outer fields, the winter light washed the landscape in muted gold. Workers paused as the Duke approached, their expressions wary yet curious. Eleanor felt the tension ripple softly, a reminder of how distant he had grown from the lives shaped by his decisions. Instead of withdrawing behind dignity, he greeted the men with measured humility, asking after their families and their harvests. The questions were simple, even tentative, but they carried the first breath of reconciliation. Eleanor stood beside him, offering clarifying remarks when needed yet allowing him the space to rediscover his role. For the first time, the tenant's eyes reflected not caution but cautious hope. As they moved from cottage to cottage, Eleanor observed subtle changes in the Duke's demeanor. His posture loosened, his voice softened, and the guarded stiffness that had once defined him seemed to thaw beneath the earnestness of those who depended on him. He asked questions she had not expected, queries about school provisions, damaged tools, and winter illnesses, and he listened with the attentiveness of someone awakening to a duty far older than his grief. Eleanor answered when required, yet stepped back when he found his footing, allowing him the dignity of reconnecting on his own terms. By the time they reached the final cottage, a quiet understanding pulsed between them, built not from sentiment but from shared responsibility, and from the tentative trust that grows when two people choose to walk the same difficult path. Upon returning to the hall, the Duke requested that the steward assemble a detailed report on all pending repairs. The staff, startled yet visibly relieved, moved quickly to comply. Eleanor remained at his side as he reviewed each document, watching the crease between his brows deepen not with frustration, but with determination. He asked for her opinion more than once, and each request carried an earnestness that hinted at genuine respect. She guided him through the practicalities without diminishing his authority, recognizing how vital it was for him to reclaim stewardship with his own hands. As afternoon shadows lengthened, he dismissed the staff and turned toward her with a gravity she had rarely seen directed at her. In his eyes lay the quiet acknowledgment that she had become indispensable, not by command, but by steadfastness, and by the gentle clarity she brought into the spaces grief had once hollowed. He walked with her into the smaller drawing room, where the late sun cast amber light across the floorboards. There, away from the expectations of staff and society, he spoke with a sincerity that startled them both. He confessed the fear that had governed his every interaction since his first wife's death, the fear that any attempt to move forward would betray a memory he cherished too deeply to relinquish. Eleanor listened without interruption, allowing the weight of his admission to settle naturally. When she finally responded, she did so with measured gentleness, reminding him that honoring the past did not require sacrificing the future. Her words did not seek to comfort through sentiment, but to offer perspective, and he accepted them with a humility that revealed how exhausted he had become from carrying sorrow alone. Later, as evening settled quietly over the estate, the Duke asked whether she would walk with him along the terrace. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke from distant hearths. They moved slowly, neither rushing nor hesitating, allowing the silence to stretch comfortably between them. When he finally spoke, his voice held a tremor of honesty she had never before heard. He told her he wished to rebuild Ashcombe not simply for tradition's sake, but because she had shown him that duty could be shaped into something living, something human. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with a tenderness she did not try to suppress. She did not promise more than she could give, but she offered her continued partnership, steady and unadorned. The Duke received her words with a gratitude that transformed the night into a quiet vow. Eleanor returned to the hall with him, feeling the subtle harmony that had begun to form between them settle like a warm hush across the corridor. At her chamber door they paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of a shared awareness that the distance separating their lives had finally begun to close. The Duke lifted her hand with tentative reverence, brushing his lips against her fingers in a gesture more meaningful than any declaration. Eleanor felt no triumph, only a quiet fulfillment that grew from knowing he offered this freely. When they parted, the hall no longer felt cold or cavernous, but alive with possibility. Their future, once shaped by duty alone, had opened to chosen purpose ahead.